Remember a few months back, Ida, the fossil that was propped up with a lot more money than scientific fact? Well, turns out it's a little closer to Garfield than the evolutionists would care to admit.
Unfortunately, this was admitted by the evolutionists, and it was admitted in the very same article that the Atheist Antidote gave us a link to. One of the articles that he cites says, they did argue that it belongs in the same major evolutionary grouping, and that it showed what an actual ancestor of that era might have looked like. The article then goes on to say, Darwinius is an example of a group of primates called Adapoids. We are happy to start the scientific discussion about what Ida means, for where Adapoids fit on the primate family tree. What this article is saying is that Ida isn't necessarily a direct human ancestor, but is instead the ancestor of a different group of animals. Is this an example of selective breeding? I'll let the viewer decide. Behind the media hype, scientists were looking at this with an open mind, more so than the Atheist Antidote would care to admit.
However, scientists are quick to point out that Ida does not necessarily represent the so-called human missing link.
We are not dealing with our grandmother, but perhaps with our grand-aunt.
So, after cherry-picking the parts of the articles that say Ida is not a human ancestor, and ignoring the parts that say Ida is still a transitional form for other groups of primates, the Atheist Antidote goes on a bit of a rant about how we're being subjected to propaganda from a global conspiracy of scientists.
Publish first, promote first, ask scientific questions, those pesky little scientific questions, later. It just goes on and on and on, and tomorrow there'll be another lie and another lie. And of course in the shadows they just sort of crawl away after the damage has been done. The very paleontologist behind the Ida campaign admitted, you need an icon or two in a museum to drag the people in. And certainly we're not going to let all that scientific fact and vetting get in the way. No! Not when there's good old-fashioned evolutionary propaganda to promote.
Unfortunately, this seems to be one of those aspects of evolution that creationists don't seem to get. So I'll explain it like this. Not all species on the planet that are living right now are human. So, not every fossil is going to be a direct ancestor of humans. So, the fact that Ida most likely is not a direct ancestor of humans doesn't negate evolution. You see, lemurs need transitional fossils too, and this, turns out, is most likely one of them. Get it?
As the peppered moths and Darwin's finches, they remain moths, they remain finches.
The idea that they would change in such a way is not a prediction made by evolution. You're still an ape. In fact, you're still a chordate and a vertebrate. Evolution merely predicts that over time, variation arises in a population, and that variation is selected for through a process called natural selection. Evolution does not predict that one day a dog will give birth to a cat or a finch will give birth to a piece of broccoli or something. An ape with a big brain is still an ape. In fact, a chordate with 2 arms, 2 legs, fingers and toes, hair, and a big brain is still a chordate.
They have a fixed ideology, a fixed worldview, a fixed religion, and it poisons the well of science again and again and again.
We next find that the Atheist Antidote thinks that a small handful of frauds or hoaxes in the past can refute an entire theory based on genetics and other fossils that aren't frauds.
Guys, this Ida nonsense, it's nothing new. Let's go through the evolutionary hoax parade, shall we? Piltdown man, fraud, lie.
After Piltdown man's, quote, discovery, unquote, numerous fossils that also fit the human ancestry were found. A couple examples of these are the town child, an Australopithecus africanus fossil, and Peking man, whose species was a subset of Homo erectus. The anthropologist Sherwood Washburn said, by this time, Piltdown just didn't make any sense. You could make sense of human evolution if you didn't try to put Piltdown man into it. The problem was that Piltdown man showed the advanced human brain evolving before the omnivorous diet, whereas other fossils that were being found elsewhere were showing the opposite. In short, Piltdown man basically created more controversy and divide than it solved. In reality, most scientists were relieved when Piltdown man turned out to be a hoax, because suddenly the evidence didn't contradict itself anymore with regards to human evolution. All of this was left out by the atheist antidote.
The Stanley Miller experiment, fraud, lie.
It should be noted that this statement itself is a lie. Now, the Miller-Urey experiment did not account for all scenarios, nor did it account for all substances on the early Earth at the time. When these extra scenarios were accounted for, however, the results of those experiments showed even better results than the Miller-Urey experiment. Creationists are often quick to cite later experiments that got different results from the Miller-Urey experiment, which is interesting, because these later experiments, which they never cite by name, for obvious reasons, got better results than the Miller-Urey experiment.
Embryonic recapitulation, fraud, refuted, thoroughly.
Haeckel's drawings weren't necessarily frauds, they were just exaggerated. Here is a picture, note, a picture, not a drawing, of a human embryo. And here is that same embryo after he put on some creationist glasses. You sometimes can't help but feel sympathy for them. There are also these things in embryonic life that are called pharyngeal grooves. Physiologically speaking, they are similar to gills, and the vast majority of them don't develop into anything, instead simply disappearing throughout the embryonic life. Sometimes, while they disappear, they don't close all the way. This causes a condition known as bronchial cleft cysts. Yeah, it definitely sounds like these are just made up by a global scientific conspiracy.
And this parade of failures is just going to continue.
I will ask that you guys please don't tell the atheist antidote that the story of the apple falling on Newton's head is now thought to be fabricated by Newton. You see, he might come to the conclusion that gravity is wrong and jump off a bridge, which wouldn't be good.